Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
You ever notice how some people carry a kind of gravity with them? Like no matter where they go, no matter what the occasion, the room just rearranges itself around them? That's my sister Madison. She's not famous. She's not rich. But somehow, she always ends up in the center of every photograph, every conversation, every memory that's supposed to belong to someone else. And for as long as I can remember, she's made sure I knew my role, to the side, out of frame, just enough in the picture to prove she had company. I didn't realize until much later how deep the roots of that power went, how thoroughly she had trained everyone, including me, to believe she was always a little shinier, a little more charming, a little more deserving of the spotlight. And maybe, in my quieter moments, I believed that too. So no, her wearing a white dress to my wedding wasn't a surprise. It wasn't even the worst thing she's ever done. It was just the most public. I was 37 when I got married. Not late, not early. I'd been engaged once before, to a man who couldn't quite decide whether he loved me or just liked the idea of being loved. We broke it off 3 months before the wedding. Madison said, "It's for the best." He never looked at you the way he looked at me. I laughed. She didn't. That was 5 years ago. I should have taken the hint then. This time, it was different. Brian was older, more grounded, the kind of man who listens with his whole face and remembers the name of your childhood dog. We met at a friend's barbecue, of all places, and within 6 months I knew. I wasn't floating or chasing or compromising, I was home. Madison met him at Thanksgiving and told me later he had resting accountant face. When I told her we were engaged, she blinked, smiled thinly, and said, "Wow. Okay, I guess it's happening. Good for you." She asked if I wanted help planning the wedding. I declined. We hadn't been close in years, not really. There was always this performance between us, this long, stretched-out tension where neither of us wanted to be the one who broke the surface first. At holidays, we danced around old wounds, and in group chats, we kept it polite. But underneath, we were both cataloging every compliment, every dig, every unspoken slight. And yet, when she sent the message, a full-length mirror selfie in a white, off-the-shoulder dress with lace detail and a slit that reached up past the thigh, I still paused and told myself maybe, just maybe, it was a joke. Her caption said, "It's cream. Don't freak out. I just look better in this color." And at the bottom, a winking face. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. I didn't sleep much the night before the wedding. Part of it was nerves, the way your brain loops through every possible disaster scenario, tripping in heels, mascara running, someone objecting like in a bad movie. But another part of me, the one that had grown up watching my sister blow out my birthday candles, accidentally spill red wine on my prom dress, and brag to our family that her SAT score wasn't even close to Jenna's, that part knew something was coming. She never missed an opportunity to recenter herself. My wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a threat to her natural order. So, when the doors opened at the ceremony and I saw her walk in, wearing that same damn dress, I wasn't shocked. I was furious. But I wasn't surprised. She strutted in like she was being announced at a gala, not seated for her sister's wedding. Heads turned. People whispered. Someone, I think one of Brian's cousins, actually gasped. Madison smiled, wide and unapologetic, waving slightly like she was entering the third act of a musical. And then, as she took her seat, she leaned over to my mother and stage whispered, "Relax, I just look better in this color." Laughter rippled through the first 2 rows. It wasn't cruel, more like awkward amusement, the way people laugh when they don't know whose side to take. But I saw my mother's face. She didn't look amused. She looked like she wanted to disappear. I took a breath. I smiled. I walked down that aisle like everything was fine. Because I'd waited too long for this, and I was not about to let her ruin it, at least, not that moment. But the seed had been planted. And while everyone else clinked glasses and danced and posed for group selfies with fake candids and too much flash, I kept my eye on her. Not because I was angry, not yet, but because I was calculating. See, I'd spent my whole life taking the high road with Madison. Every slight, every insult, every time she managed to make my joy about her. I let it go. I told myself I was being mature, that it wasn't worth the fight, that she was just wired that way. But standing there in front of 130 guests, in a dress I picked after 12 fittings, watching my sister smirk in white, I felt something shift. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was just exhaustion. But I made a decision right then. If the universe handed me an opening, just one tiny crack to push back, I would take it. And then, as if summoned by fate or irony or just plain clumsy luck, that crack arrived. Not with a bang, but with a splash. It was sometime during the third round of drinks, after the father-daughter dance and before the cake cutting. Madison had been circling the fountain in the courtyard with a glass of champagne and a group of people I didn't recognize, probably friends from her yoga class or her overpriced hair salon. She was laughing too loudly, tossing her hair, reenacting something dramatic with sweeping hand gestures. And then, one step too far, one heel too high, one ego too heavy, she lost her balance. And in full view of at least 50 guests, including both sets of in-laws, she went over the edge and into the water. It wasn't deep, maybe knee-high, but deep enough to soak the dress, cling it to every curve, and turn her expensive cream fabric into something entirely see-through. And as people rushed forward with towels and gasps and someone shouting, "Oh my God," my cousin Jason stood perfectly still, phone in hand, recording the whole thing. He caught the slip, the flail, the shriek, and the splash. All of it, framed like a masterpiece. Later that night, after the guests had mostly gone home, after Brian and I had done the awkward, giggly undressing and collapsed into hotel sheets with aching feet and full hearts, Jason sent me the video. No message, just the clip. I watched it once, then again, then a third time. And I didn't laugh. Not out loud. I just sat there, watching the playback, thinking, maybe this is what the universe looks like when it finally evens the score. Maybe it was time I stopped playing the nice one. Maybe I'd been holding onto too many high roads that never led anywhere. And as the video looped back to the beginning, right before her foot missed the edge, right before her mouth formed that perfect "oh," I whispered to myself something I hadn't dared to think in years. Not this time. Not her. Not again. There's a strange kind of satisfaction in pretending everything is fine when the truth is clawing at your insides like a feral animal looking for daylight, and I had gotten so good at it over the years that on the outside, no one would have guessed that I was standing on a fault line, just waiting for the tremor to come. I smiled through the speeches, hugged relatives I barely knew, danced with my husband like I had nothing to worry about, and let the warmth of the champagne blur the edges of my thoughts. But deep down, I was simmering. Not just from the dress or the insult or even the laughter that followed it like a reflex people couldn't stop themselves from giving. No, what burned was the certainty that this moment, this day that I had waited years for, saved for, dreamed about, and planned down to the last flower petal, would now be remembered not as my wedding, but as the one where the bride's sister stole the spotlight wearing white. I could see her out of the corner of my eye throughout the reception, floating from group to group like a celebrity at a charity gala, always talking too loudly, always pausing just long enough to catch the attention of anyone who might have looked away for a second too long. Madison had this ability, this dangerous, calculated ability, to perform intimacy without ever actually being present. She touched arms, laughed too easily, stared just a second too long, and left people feeling like they'd been chosen by someone rare, someone just out of reach. And they ate it up. They always had. She drank like she was on stage too, long sips from a tall-stemmed flute, delicate fingers curled just so, lips always stained with just the right amount of berry-colored gloss. I remember thinking, with this odd detachment, that it was like watching a movie I had seen a dozen times, where the plot never changed, and I kept hoping against all reason that this time the ending would be different. But it never was, because Madison never slipped. Until she did. The courtyard behind the reception hall had been transformed into the soft, glowing oasis, lanterns in the trees, candles floating in glass bowls on the surface of the fountain, a string quartet playing something that sounded expensive but forgettable. Guests were scattered around with drinks in hand, some dancing on the temporary wooden floor laid over the grass, others chatting near the dessert table, and in the middle of it all, Madison, barefoot now, heels dangling from one hand, the other wrapped loosely around a nearly empty champagne glass, was laughing with a group of men I didn't recognize. It was one of those moments where everything slows down without warning. You're not sure why your brain zooms in on something, but it does, and you just watch. I remember seeing her toss her hair, lean back dramatically with a smirk, one foot stepping just a little too far onto the wet stone lip of the fountain, and then, almost in slow motion, her body tilted, arms flailing like a windmill losing power, mouth open in a perfect O as she went tumbling backward into the water with a splash that silenced half the yard. Gasps followed. A few people laughed, those uncomfortable, stunned laughs that bubble up before your brain catches up to what you've just seen. Someone screamed, a sharp little, "Oh my God," that might have come from Aunt Lydia, though I wasn't sure. The quartet stopped playing mid-bar. Madison surfaced a second later, soaked from head to toe, her makeup smeared like a watercolor, her white dress now practically transparent, plastered to her body in a way that stripped it of any remaining elegance. She looked like a drowned bride from a Gothic novel, all dripping silk and ruined vanity. People rushed toward her, a few genuinely concerned, others eager to witness the spectacle more closely, but I stayed where I was. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just stared. Because in that moment, for the first time in what felt like decades, she wasn't in control. She wasn't performing. She wasn't winning. She was flailing, wet, humiliated, and exposed. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel like the second-place sibling. I felt calm. Jason, my cousin, who's always had a weird sense of timing and a knack for catching things others miss, had his phone out the entire time. He hadn't even tried to hide it. He was grinning like a kid at a fireworks show, watching the playback before the shock had even worn off the rest of the crowd. Later, he sent it to me. No caption. No comment. Just the video file, silently waiting in my inbox like a gift I hadn't known I wanted. I watched it back once, on the edge of the bed in our hotel suite, Brian asleep behind me, his breathing soft and steady, his arm draped lazily across my waist like a promise. The moment played out exactly as I remembered: the step, the slip, the splash, the gasps, and then Madison, sputtering, mascara trailing down her cheeks like twin rivers of regret. And as I sat there in the quiet, the city glowing faintly beyond the window, the sounds of the party now distant echoes in my memory, I realized something I hadn't dared let myself believe before. I had a choice. I could take the high road again. I could delete the video, laugh it off, bury the incident in the vault with all the other times she had made me feel invisible. Or I could keep it. Use it. Let it breathe in the light for once. Because maybe, just maybe, it wasn't petty to hold a mirror up to someone who had spent her whole life dancing around one. Maybe justice, when it finally comes, doesn't arrive with fanfare or drama or poetic speeches. Maybe it just shows up in a soaked dress and a perfectly captured moment of karma. I didn't decide that night. I wasn't sure what kind of woman I wanted to be just yet. But I knew, without a doubt, that if I ever wanted to level the playing field, I finally had the means to do it. And for once, Madison wouldn't see it coming. The next morning began with the deceptive quiet that only the first hours after a wedding can bring, that strange, heavy silence where exhaustion and adrenaline mix like stale champagne and lipstick-stained coffee cups, and everything around you feels both earned and unfinished. Brian was still sleeping, one arm flung across the comforter, the imprint of his tuxedo pants folded carelessly on the chair near the window, while I sat wrapped in a hotel robe, legs tucked under me, nursing a mug of bitter coffee that had probably been sitting on the tray since dawn. Outside, the sky was a dull pewter, clouded over, thick with the heaviness of early summer humidity, and for a moment, I let myself believe that maybe today would just pass, uneventful, unremarkable, gently forgettable, that maybe, for once, the aftershock wouldn't follow the quake. But I knew better. It had taken me less than an hour after waking to rewatch the video. 3 times, maybe 4. Each time, I noticed something new, the exact moment her heel caught the rim, the awkward twist of her torso as she tried to recover, the sharp, splashing sound of the water like a punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence. And each time, I felt less guilt and more certainty. I didn't laugh, not in the way people wanted me to, the vindictive, triumphant kind of laugh that would have signaled to the universe that justice had been served, but there was something in me that unraveled just a little more with every frame. Something taut that finally loosened after years of being yanked and stretched by her smugness, her vanity, and her constant, unwavering ability to make everything about herself. I didn't post the video out of revenge, not initially. I didn't even post it right away. At first, I just saved it, as if I were storing proof, a quiet sort of evidence that the world had, just for 1 second, turned on its axis and handed me something unexpected. I stared at the thumbnail in my photo gallery, thumb hovering above the share button, heart pounding in a way that surprised me. I think I wanted someone else to tell me it was okay, that it wasn't cruel, that it was deserved. But instead, I did what I always do. I turned to my own sense of right and wrong, chipped and weathered though it may be, and I hit post. It wasn't a public upload. I wasn't interested in going viral or collecting views from strangers who had no idea about the history between us, who would just see another wedding fail and laugh without context. No, I posted it to a private group, our extended family Facebook page, a digital threadbare quilt of cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends who shared baby photos and vacation updates and recipe swaps and the occasional political meme, depending on who had been drinking that day. It was a quiet space, relatively harmless, and to me, it felt just contained enough to be honest without being explosive. I captioned it simply, well, I guess there was a splash of color at the wedding after all. And that was it. No names. No tags. Just the video, blurry and grainy, Madison's center frame, flailing, falling, emerging like a wet cat from the fountain she'd practically climbed into herself. It didn't take long. Less than 20 minutes passed before the comments started trickling in, little reactions from our cousins, a few laugh emojis, someone typing, "OMG poor thing LOL," and then the long silence that meant people were sharing it in private messages, in group chats, sending it to people who weren't in the group but needed to see it because, apparently, nothing travels faster than family gossip carried on the back of an embarrassing video. I knew the call was coming. I felt it like a storm gathering heat on the edge of the sky, heavy and loud and impossible to outrun. The phone buzzed so hard against the nightstand I thought it might leap off, and when I saw her name flash across the screen, Madison, sister, in all caps, no emoji, no nickname, I felt this bizarre mixture of fear and satisfaction, like I had finally stepped onto a stage I'd been building in my mind for decades. I didn't even get out a hello before she started, not yelling, not crying, but screaming, the kind of primal, incoherent screech that bypasses language altogether and dives straight into the chest like a fist. Her voice was high and cracked and wild, and the only words I could make out were, "How dare you," disrespect, jealous, and ruined. She said I had humiliated her, that I had crossed a line, that it wasn't just petty, it was evil. And through all of it, I didn't say a word. I just listened. She told me the dress wasn't even that white, that the lighting made it worse, that everyone had been laughing because it was funny and I needed to stop taking everything so personally. And then she started crying, not sobbing, but that dramatic, breathy kind of cry that's meant to provoke sympathy, to signal that she's the victim now, that somehow she is the one we should be worried about. And even then, part of me wavered. Because no matter how much damage she caused, she was still my sister, and there's something deeply unnatural about watching someone unravel when you know you could stop it with a simple apology. But I didn't. Because this time, I didn't believe her tears. I had seen the smirk. I had heard the line about looking better in white. I had felt the weight of every year she'd made me invisible. And if she wanted to cry now, then fine, let her cry. Eventually, she ran out of steam. Her voice hoarse, her fury spent, she said something like, "I hope you're happy," and hung up before I could answer. I sat there, still staring at the phone, my hand numb, the silence in the room suddenly louder than it had been all morning. I could hear Brian stirring behind me, the sheets rustling, his voice soft and half awake as he asked if everything was okay, and I said, yeah, even though it wasn't. Even though something between my sister and me had shifted permanently, in a way that neither of us had the tools to fix. And yet, underneath all the chaos, all the noise, all the guilt that buzzed in my chest like a hive threatening to break open, I felt something else too. Not pride exactly, not happiness, but a cold sort of clarity. For the first time in my life, I hadn't backed down. I hadn't swallowed it or buried it or brushed it off to keep the peace. I had drawn a line, and she had crossed it, and now we were both living on the other side of the fallout. But then, something strange happened, just as I began to think it was over, that maybe now we'd go back to our corners and rebuild some version of sisterhood out of the rubble. A message popped up on my phone. It wasn't from Madison. It was from someone else entirely. A name I hadn't seen in years. A woman I'd almost forgotten until I read her words. Hey, Jenna. I know this is random, but I thought you should know. There's more to the story with your sister. And with Brian. And, just like that, everything I thought I knew about the last 24 hours cracked open, because suddenly the video wasn't the story, it was just the beginning. There's a particular weight to the kind of silence that follows betrayal, a weight not easily described, as it doesn't scream or stab or even whisper, it just settles into the bones, like old humidity in the walls of a house. Unnoticed at first, but slowly suffocating, inch by inch, until every breath feels just a little heavier than the last. I sat there for a long time after I read that message, my phone burning in my hand as though it had just told me a truth my heart had been trying not to hear for years, and for a moment I genuinely wished I hadn't opened it at all, hadn't read the words, hadn't allowed my curiosity to drag me back into a chapter one thought I had closed and bolted shut. The message was short, unassuming even, just a few lines from a name I hadn't seen in half a decade, Erica Landry. Brian's ex, the one who had always been a little too pretty, a little too loud, the kind of woman who made you feel like you were borrowing time if your boyfriend looked at her for too long. We'd crossed paths a few times early in my relationship with Brian, mostly at group dinners and birthday parties. Before she moved out of state and became one of those names that you only hear in passing when someone's reminiscing about college or exes or the way things used to be. She and Brian had dated, briefly but intensely, the kind of relationship that burns fast and leaves scorch marks, and I'd never been threatened by her, not really, until now. Her message had no preamble, no apology, no polite disclaimers to soften the blow. It just read, I thought you should know. Your sister and Brian were together once, not just a one-time thing. She told me it didn't matter because he never loved her. But she bragged about it after he got with you. Said he'd always wanted her first. I reread it 3 times, each time hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less painful, something easier to dismiss. But they didn't. They stayed still, quiet and firm, like a verdict I hadn't realized was being read. The breath caught in my throat in that awful, inevitable way that it does when you just know, that this isn't a misunderstanding or a lie or someone trying to stir up trouble for the hell of it. This was real. This was her. And suddenly, the years unraveled. All the little moments that hadn't made sense, the way Madison used to ask too many questions about Brian, her overly familiar tone when his name came up, the way she once jokingly told me, "You sure he doesn't like taller women?" and laughed when I didn't. I'd brushed it off as her usual competitive nonsense, the casual cruelty that slipped into her voice whenever I seemed too happy, too certain, too loved. But now, those things felt different. Now, they felt deliberate. I remembered a New Year's Eve party, years before Brian and I had started dating, where Madison had disappeared for an hour and came back flushed and triumphant, whispering something to her friend Jenna P., not me, another Jenna, as if the universe enjoyed doubling my misfortune, and when I asked her later where she'd gone, she just shrugged and said, "You wouldn't be interested. It's grown-up stuff." I remembered thinking how smug she looked, how satisfied, like she'd pulled off a small coup and was waiting for the crown. Back then, I hadn't known Brian had even been at that party. The idea that they'd been together, not in a casual, forgettable sense, but in a way that mattered enough for her to remember, to gloat about, to weaponize. It hit me in the stomach like a cold punch. It wasn't just that they had history. It was that she'd kept it from me. Worse, she'd sat at my engagement dinner, toasted with sparkling rose, hugged me for the cameras, and smiled in that perfect, practiced way of hers, all while knowing that I was building a future with a man she had already touched, already tasted, and worst of all, already used as ammunition in her endless war against me. I didn't confront Brian right away. I needed time. Time to process, to understand if I could trust my own judgment, to figure out if the man who had slept beside me every night for the past 2 years had been lying by omission or simply avoiding a fire he hoped would never reignite. I sat with it. I let it fester. And in that festering, I discovered a level of restraint I didn't know I possessed. Later that evening, after we returned home, I waited until he had unpacked the suitcases, fed the dog, and finally slumped onto the couch, exhausted but content in that way only husbands can be after a successful wedding, when they think the hard part is over and the road ahead is smooth. I sat across from him and asked, as casually as I could manage, if he'd ever hooked up with Madison. He froze, not dramatically, not guiltily, but in that subtle, terrifying way that someone freezes when they've been caught holding a truth they hoped never to explain. He didn't lie. Not really. He admitted it happened once. A long time ago, before we were together, before he even knew my name, he said. A party, too many drinks, no feelings. He said it like a confession, with enough shame in his eyes to make me believe he hadn't expected it to matter. And maybe if she hadn't weaponized it, if she hadn't twisted that moment into something to lord over me, it wouldn't have. But Madison never let anything die quietly. She always circled back, always found the wound she could press on the hardest, always made sure she had something sharp in her hand, just in case. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just nodded and said I understood, and I think that scared him more than if I had exploded. Because he knew that when I go quiet, when I start thinking more than I speak, I'm building something. A decision. A plan. A reckoning. And in that silence, a new thought took shape, not about him, or her, or even the past, but about what came next. Because now, the video wasn't just a funny accident. It was a weapon. And I had just begun to realize how deeply it could cut. There are moments in life that come not with thunder or flashing lights or applause, but with a terrifying, almost sacred quiet, the kind of stillness that settles over you when the final piece clicks into place. And you suddenly realize the person you've been becoming for years has finally arrived, not as a scream, not as a fight, but as a cold, deliberate choice that requires no justification because it's been earned through years of swallowing your tongue, softening your voice, dimming your light, and playing the smaller role in a story that was never supposed to be about anyone else. That's how it felt when I made the decision. Not like revenge. Not like rage. But like inevitability. After the conversation with Brian, if you can even call it a conversation when it consists of a single question, a short answer, and a silence so dense it might as well have been another person in the room, I didn't sleep that night. Not out of fury or heartbreak or disbelief, but because something inside me had finally shifted from reaction to clarity, and that kind of clarity doesn't let you sleep. It paces, it sharpens, it plans. I didn't leave him. That may come later, or maybe it won't. The truth is, whatever happened between Brian and Madison before he knew me is irrelevant compared to the fact that she knew, and she used it. And she waited until the very day I was supposed to begin something sacred and new to remind me that nothing I had was ever fully mine, not without her fingerprints on it first. And so, when I woke up the next morning, still hollowed out but strangely steady, I did the one thing I knew would catch her off guard. I sent her a gift. It was a wine bottle, custom engraved, wrapped in a thick velvet bag and delivered by courier with a handwritten note. Not a long note. Just enough to remind her that this wasn't an accident or a coincidence or a lapse in judgment. The bottle, a sharp French rose she always claimed gave her migraines, had the words etched into the glass with surgical precision. To the real star of the night, don't fall in this one. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. She'd know. She'd feel it. And more importantly, she'd understand that I was done playing the game by her rules. But the gift wasn't the end. It was just the opening move of a final act I'd been composing in the quiet corners of my mind for years, stitched together from all the small humiliations, the snide remarks, the stolen moments, the subtle erasures she performed so effortlessly, and the way she carried herself through my life as though I were a backdrop, a placeholder, something to be tolerated rather than cherished. What came next wasn't explosive. It didn't involve screaming matches or public showdowns. That would have given her what she always craved: attention, spectacle, the thrill of being at the center of chaos. No, I did something simpler, something quieter, something I knew would echo in her bones longer than any argument ever could. I reached out to her ex-husband. Now, let me be clear, I didn't do it to hurt him. Tyler had always been kind to me, even after the divorce, always cordial, occasionally vulnerable in that broken, post-marriage way where he'd make small, apologetic jokes about how he should have known better, how he ignored the signs, how Madison was always in love with someone else, and that someone else was usually herself. We met for coffee, just coffee, nothing salacious or vengeful, nothing intimate beyond the quiet comfort of two people who knew what it felt like to be lied to by the same woman. I told him everything. Not in a gloating way. Not as a sales pitch. Just the facts, the dress, the comment, the fall, the video, the buried truth about Brian, the years of swallowing every insult until they formed a lump in my throat I could no longer pretend wasn't choking me. And Tyler, bless him, didn't offer pity or outrage. He just listened. Nodded. Sipped his coffee like he'd known it all along, like my words were puzzle pieces he'd been missing, and now the picture finally made sense. We didn't hug. We didn't flirt. We didn't plot. We just sat in that quiet, measured understanding that sometimes the worst betrayals don't come from enemies or strangers, but from the people who've memorized all your weaknesses and saved them for later. I posted one final message to the family Facebook group, carefully timed so it wouldn't feel like a continuation of the drama, but rather a soft epilogue. I included a single photo, not of the fountain fall, not of Madison in her see-through dress, but of me and Brian, taken at the very end of the night, both of us a little drunk, a little sweaty, exhausted but grinning, the string lights behind us flickering like fireflies. My caption was simple. Despite a few unexpected twists, it was still the best night of my life. Grateful to everyone who made it unforgettable. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't cruel. But it was unmistakable. And Madison, I knew, would read it over and over again, dissecting every word, looking for the hidden dagger I had tucked behind the polite gratitude, and she'd find it. She always did. I don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe she'll call again. Maybe she'll send another message, one of her grand, passive-aggressive apologies that sounds like a compliment dipped in arsenic. Or maybe she'll disappear for a while, retreat into that world of curated Instagram stories and filtered brunches and carefully posed photos where nothing ever goes wrong and no one ever falls into fountains. Or maybe, and this is the part of me that still believes people can change, maybe she'll sit with what she did and finally, truly feel it. As for me, I've stopped waiting for an apology. I've stopped rehearsing the speech where I tell her how much she hurt me, how many birthdays she tainted, how many smiles I faked because I didn't want to start a war I didn't think I could win. I don't need that anymore. Because in the end, she made herself the center of my wedding, and I let her for one night. But the next morning, I took it back. And every time I pour a glass of champagne now, I don't toast to peace or closure or even healing. I toast to the fall. To the moment the mask slipped. To the final, glorious silence of not needing to prove myself to anyone who never truly saw me. And sometimes, when I take that first sip, I still wonder if I went too far, if posting the video, sending the bottle, meeting with Tyler, was all just another version of her game, dressed in better words. But then I remember her face, right before the splash, that split second where control gave way to gravity, and I feel, not triumph, but something better: freedom. Freedom from her. Freedom from playing small. And the bittersweet, sparkling joy of knowing the story finally belonged to me.